Recording is on.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the second episode of Beyond Talking Points. It's your co-host, Matt, here with my fellow co-host, Matthew. And today we have a more structured episode compared to last week. So this time we're going to talk about the 5 CNN town halls that happened last week. So the Democratic candidates that got an hour allocated to them by CNN. So we're going to talk about Amy Klobuchar, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris, and Pete Buttigieg. What we kind of did is, instead of breaking down like the whole town hall, because they're kind of repetitive, we each had one takeaway that we wanted to talk about from each town hall, and then we'll discuss that takeaway. We're aiming to do about 5 minutes each for each of our points, so we can get 10 points down in under an hour. That's our idea. Some topics we're going to talk about more than others, and yes, some are just going to be quick rants from one of us. Others are going to be a little bit of debating and sparring about how we see the issues. It should be fun, and I think there is a lot more we're going to disagree on here. So to start with Amy Klobuchar, my big takeaway was how she talked about specifically reducing cost of pharmaceutical drugs for Americans. So this was a point that came up in a lot of the town halls, especially even in the past before these 5. A lot of people are talking about reducing pharmaceutical prices. And this talking point jumps out to me in a way that kind of irked me, because I feel like it misses the economic implications of the policy. So the reason why pharmaceuticals cost more in the United States compared to other countries is because there's an economic incentive for it. The way pharmaceutical companies make money is they invest a lot of money in products. Some products don't pan out, some do. And they have a patent on that product, and they profit a ton of money in a short period of time, and that's how they profit off a drug. And I hear these candidates talking about how we need lower prices, we need more generics. And I guess the reason this concerns me is we've heard a lot of discussion about the need for generics and reducing the prices, but they don't talk about if that's going to disincentivize more innovation. And I guess that's one of those unspoken concerns, that they act like it's all good, it's easy. We do what people in Europe are doing. They have low costs for a reason, but they don't talk about why the costs are high here. And I think there's going to be some unintended consequences for this policy. And that's kind of been a concern for me hearing Klobuchar bring it up, even though she's more moderate on healthcare than the rest. That was kind of a sticking point. I'm going to toss it over to my co-host, Matthew, see if he has anything else, or if that was just a rant of mine, and then we might move on.
Thank you. I don't have much more to say about that point, although it does tie into my takeaway, my main takeaway from it somewhat. Amy Klobuchar is the only candidate running at the moment, from what I understand, that is against Medicare for all. Now, I'm not exactly what you'd call a single issue voter, but healthcare is very important to me. And I just cannot understand why we're still having this debate of, is healthcare a right? Is it not a right? Is it a privilege? It seems to me that we need to get past this as a country, because you mentioned how pharmaceuticals are run differently in Europe. So is healthcare in general. Many European countries have universal healthcare, and as I say, I think it's a right, because you can't live your life without healthcare. You could try, but you will get sick one day. You will need medical attention if you want to live a happy, healthy life. Let me know when the 5 minutes is up. I don't want to go overboard.
Well, so I want to push back on that. And I figure that since these two topics intertwine, and it's Klobuchar, we'll just do 10 minutes in total. So I'm keeping track. But one thing I did want to say is So I would push back on some things you said there, but the point that I was kind of getting at with the pharmaceuticals, and I think it does tie into Medicare, or Medicare, Medicaid for all, is I think the Democrats are well intentioned. I don't think they're bad people. I don't think they're trying to necessarily control everybody's lives, but I think they miss the trade-offs on these policies. A thing that you hear from conservatives a lot when you talk about Medicare for all is how the reason why so many inventions happens and so many a lot of innovation happens on the medical side in the United States, and there's a reason for that. You take away a lot of those incentives when you make it so the government is funding all of it. So I see that firsthand. Pharmaceuticals, like pharmaceutical companies, need to profit for a short term to make up all their ROI and all their failed products, and that's why they cost so much for a period. And then you let generics in. It makes sense, and it sucks for people for that time period, but the business isn't sustainable otherwise. So when I hear people talk about Medicare for all, you can argue it's all right, but I just don't think that takes away all the disincentives you put into a system once you make the government run it and you take it away from private parties. That's just my initial pushback. I feel like it's good intention, but I don't feel like it actually will work on the large scale that is the United States for a lot of those reasons.
Yes. I would also say I don't think Republicans are I don't think Republicans are trying to keep healthcare from everybody. I'm not again, like I agree with you in this on this point where we shouldn't demonize the other side. But I think where we disagree is where you see innovation, I see bureaucracy. I see just a healthcare system which is not serving the needs of the majority. Again, of course, I don't have the numbers on me at the moment, but I mean, of course, we'll go into Bernie Sanders, but he talks about this, and I agree with him. I think we have some of the worst outcomes for a first world nation, and we put so much money into it. So that would be my rebuttal.
Okay, well, I think there's a lot there. I guess the first thing I'd push back is I don't think our system's good, but I also don't think our system is a good example of a purely privatized system. I think the real issue comes to the fact that insurance is tied into your job. There is no reason why your insurance should be attached to our job, but it is because it's a perk that keeps people in their jobs, so it benefits employers. I don't think this easy solution is we make the government run it. I think the solution is we figure out ways to avoid all this tie up with employers. And then there are some other bureaucratic elements, which I totally agree with, but I don't think that'll be solved with government. One innate feature of government is it's not bureaucracy accidentally. Government has to be accountable. That's why every single time a government agency opens up, it's bureaucratic, because they have to prove that they meet all the standards that Congress sets for them. They have to show like, oh, this person qualifies for this program for all these 10 reasons, which inevitably requires tons of paperwork and tons of employees to go through and double check all these things to make sure there's no abuse. So the fact that the government runs something and it's accountable to taxpayers inevitably makes it more bureaucratic. I don't think that healthcare is any exception. If you make taxpayers fund healthcare, taxpayers need to be shown that their money is being used effectively, and it's going to beget more bureaucracy. So although I agree our current system is bureaucratic, I just don't see Medicare for all fixing that. We got a minute left. If you want to just do a closing point on that before we move on to Elizabeth Warren.
Sure. I don't think bureaucracy will ever totally go away. I would just say that there are some bureaucracies that work better than others. And when it comes to healthcare, I am certainly willing to allow the government to help in that respect. In other areas, I am more anti-government intervention. But in this respect, I think it's the government's job.
Nice. I think this is the first of many times we'll talk about this, and I think it'll be fun.
I'm sure.
There's a lot more there for both of us that both of us want to say. But moving on to Elizabeth Warren, the first thing that jumped out to me there was her big plan of rolling back student loans. So She pretty much said that any household that makes less than $250,000 should have their student loans forgiven. And then she explains that she wants to pay for this with a wealth tax on the super rich who have 50 million in wealth or more. So I hate so much about this, so let me try to break it down. So step one, people who have college degrees are going to be higher earners over the course of their life than people without college degrees. You're essentially rolling out a plan that subsidizes the decision of people who are middle and upper middle class and not poor. Generally, policies that are from the left help the people who are actually impoverished, so you can make a good case that you should use government intervention to help them. This is a case of it affects a lot of people, but they're actually people who are pretty well off. Having debt sucks, but they're people who are going to live middle class, upper middle class lives. So that's the first thing that bugs me. Second is the wealth tax. There's a lot of pieces you guys can look up out there, but it's really impractical. If somebody has $50 million in wealth, you're taxing their everything they own, right? So if somebody owns a ton of real estate because they're a very wealthy person, you have to get somebody to then appraise every piece of real estate they have, and then like every piece in their art collection, and then you have to deal with the disputes of the super rich over how much their stuff is actually worth, all to put a number on how much you should tax somebody. There was a lot in the whole Trump, how he owned real estate and his taxes that had come out on Rachel Maddow's show a couple years ago. And it was all about how there might have been some fraud there with them saying property was worth less than it is. That's what's going to happen with this kind of tax. People are going to say, no, this estate's only worth this much money. And the government's going to say, no, it's worth way more. And then you're going to have disputes. And you're actually going to have a hard time valuating these illiquid assets. It's just not practical. A bunch of countries in Europe have tried it, and most of them dropped it for a reason. And the last thing about the tax is it also might be unconstitutional. We had to do an amendment for the income tax. There's a whole case about why the wealth tax would be unconstitutional and wouldn't even be able to be put into practice. So those are like three things I initially hate. I did see a great tweet that said something along the lines of, I want somebody to defend this policy and use it in this framing. And the framing was, I think we should use the government's monopoly on force to make taxpayers pay for your college debt. And it just doesn't seem like a good way of using taxpayer money. It also will cost like $1 trillion. So that's my 3-minute rant. I just kind of went for it there. So your thoughts on her rollback of student loans?
I will admit, I am not an expert in tax policy. I know you're not either, but you're an economics major. So I suspect you would know a bit more about it than I would. I am not, from what I understand, I am not against her plan to roll back student loan debt for anyone with a household income below $250,000 a year. I'm also not against taxing the wealthier more. And I'll tell you why. If you tax a poor person more, they have nothing. If you tax a middle-class person more, they become poor. If you tax a rich person more, they become slightly less rich, perhaps upper middle class. Now, I don't have a problem with that. I know, nobody likes to pay taxes. When I got my first paycheck and I looked it over and I saw the taxes that were taken out, my gut reaction was, oh my God, why did they do that? How unfair. But we have taxes for a reason. Taxes go to pay for schools, to pay for roads, to pay for infrastructure.
Okay, but real quick, I do want to push back on taxes do pay for some things, but you're saying that not only are you okay with taxing rich people, but you're okay with taxing rich people to pay for upper middle class people's loans and middle class people loans. $200,000 in household income is a lot of money. Like, I get that loans are tough, but I don't know. I just felt the need to push back on that because we're out of time and we need to move into your part on Elizabeth Warren. I do appreciate the pushback and I hated to cut you off there. I just had to say something before we ran out of time. So go ahead and talk about your takeaway from her town hall.
Yes, I have a bit more to say about my takeaway. I'm sure we'll touch on tax policy much more in the future. she, the one thing that struck me when I watched the town hall, she is incredibly gung-ho about impeaching the president. Now, I am not the president's biggest fan.
Me neither. For the record, I'm not either.
Yeah. But I think, and I could be wrong about this, but I think it's bad strategically at this point. I think the Democrats need to focus on getting him out of office in 2020. If they fail at that, I would be more open to a question of impeachment. But I even then, I'm not sure I would want it. But I just think it's bad strategically. I think it's going to seem as if, the Democrats are just the anti-Trump party, and therefore, and that's just going to play into the narrative of, Trump's an anti-establishment candidate who these terrible Democrats are trying to ruin ruin his policies, because all he wants to do is shake up the system and help the average guy. And of course, I don't think that's true.
Yeah, I get a lot of that. I don't necessarily think it's smart for Democrats to actually impeach, but I do think there is a lot of benefit from saying that you want to impeach him. The thing is, if you look at the primaries right now, Elizabeth Warren isn't going to get ahead because she says she hates Trump, because every candidate in the field hates Trump. So I don't really think she gets a lot of political capital from it. I do think if they actually did impeach or attempt to impeach, that would just make Trump more likely to get elected. Because because you're going to fire up his base even more than they already are. A lot of people who are in Trump's base are pretty down on him in the sense that he hasn't, built the wall and done a lot of things he's promised. So for that reason, people in his base aren't super fired up about him. And then the people will only turn out to vote for him if his opposition just, fires them up. So a way to fire them up would be to impeach the president for obstruction when they can't prove collusion. But yeah, this isn't something I feel that strongly about. It's more of a political analysis than it is actual policy.
Should I say a little more, or are we out of time?
No. If you have more to say, go for it. You got like a couple of minutes.
I agree. It certainly isn't policy. There's nothing to disagree with there. And I agree. It's not. Obviously, every Democrat doesn't like the president. Do you want
to move on?
I think.
Oh, okay. Go ahead. Sorry.
Let me just say one more quick thing, and then we can move on. I think that. I mean, it might seem in the short term, it might seem as if the Democrats would gain something by saying this, but I don't think that's true. I think it will certainly hurt them in the long term. I'm not even sure it's going to help them in the short term.
Gotcha. Okay, so now we're going to move on to Bernie Sanders town hall briefly. So the thing that I wanted to talk about was first off, the town hall felt like a greatest hits tour for Bernie Sanders. That's how everything he does feels like now. But the thing that broke news is the thing that I want to talk about, especially it broke news on the right, was him saying, he essentially was asked, do you think prisoners should vote, and including the Boston bomber? And then Bernie Sanders pretty much said, unfortunately, they're horrible, but yes, they should vote, and they should be able to vote from prison. And he essentially framed it by saying, if voting is a right, then you can't take away their rights, so they should be able to vote. Which at first I thought that was interesting. I think the whole thing about voting being a right or a privilege is kind of a debate. I'm not a big defender of democracy in general, because I think democracy has a lot of downsides. I think democracy is truly the least worst form of government. So I initially didn't really care about this, but then I thought about it for like 30 seconds, and I had the thought, well, if somebody is thrown in prison, aren't they already deprived of a ton of rights? So why would voting be any different? You're put in a cage essentially, and you can't see your family, and you can't go outside for more than an hour a day, and you have to, and you can only read like books in their tiny library. It's like, sounds like we've already deprived them of a lot of liberties. I don't feel like voting is a very big difference than being thrown in a cage. Like that being taken away is, that much of a gap. So his argument of it's a right, so you can't take it away, seems kind of ridiculous to me when you consider that being imprisoned is being deprived of your rights already. So yeah, I thought that was very substanceless. It seemed like he said something very stupid for no real reason, and then it's just going to be in 100 attack ads for the next 2 years. So yeah, did you have any thoughts on that?
I admit I am agnostic on this point. I'm not sure whether prisoners or whether everyone uses the Boston Marathon bomber as an example, whether the Boston Marathon bomber should be allowed to vote or not. I will take Kamala Harris's line. I'll say I think it's worth having a discussion about it. I'm not certain where I fall on the question, but I think it's certainly worth asking.
Yeah, I mean, if the whole strategy is to say ridiculous things like this in order to compromise and then make it so nonviolent felons can vote again, then it's a smart ploy. Because I think you can convince a lot of people that nonviolent felons or like people who have felony drug offenses should be able to vote if they didn't harm anybody. Although then that raises a lot of questions of, do they only have a felony drug offense on their record because they plead down from like an assault or something? Because a lot of times they plea, and then that's a whole confusing territory that you can get into. But like, if you're telling me that a rapist should vote from their prison cell, that's just a tough sell for me. But I don't think it is a principled conversation, which is why there is room to actually debate over it, which is a valid stance, I think, because there's no reason to automatically say no or yes. But yeah, I just feel like this got a lot of airtime that was unnecessary. But do you want to move on ahead to your takeaway?
Yeah. I think Sanders is trying to be as inclusive as possible, and this might have been a time when he put his foot in his mouth. But moving on to the what struck me most about it is really what is at the heart of his campaign, which is at the heart of his campaign is the question: what should we do about the massive income inequality that we face? Now, this goes back slightly to Elizabeth Warren's point about student loans, but it goes far beyond that, of course. Let's see. Here he said, well, I don't know if these numbers are exactly true, but I'm just quoting him. He says there is something wrong when the top 1% owns more wealth than the bottom 92%. And he also believes there's something wrong with billionaires being allowed to spend unlimited amounts of money on candidates. The Mayor Pete Buttigieg, however you pronounce his name, he also brought this up. But I think it's a point that Sanders has been driving home, I think, far longer because he's obviously far older. But I agree with him. I think there's something has to be done about this massive income inequality. It can't go on. I don't think.
Okay. Well, we talked about this a little bit when we talked about Ray Dalio on the last episode. And I kind of staked out my stance as the income inequality, I think, is a bad phrase because I think it confuses I feel like it takes a real problem, which is poverty. And it implies that poverty is at fault of the rich people. So by framing it as income inequality, you're saying the issue is the disparity and not the poor people at the bottom, which seems like you're taking something that's clearly a problem and needlessly putting it in a Marxist framework. So I find that framing an issue because I don't think.
Can I disagree with you here?
Oh yeah. Go for it.
I don't think. I agree that we should not be blamed. We should not look at the rich. I mean, we should not look at this as a rich versus poor situation. Oh, the poor are virtuous, the rich are evil. Anyone who's rich or anyone who has a lot of money, obviously, did it because they use child labor. Obviously, I agree. We should not look at this in a black and white manner. So I don't think I don't want to tax the rich more because they're evil. I want to tax the rich more because they have more money. That's the bottom line for me.
So the issue that I have with that is he phrases things in a way I find misleading. So currently I live a great lifestyle. I don't have that much money at all. And I can do a ton of things because we live in the United States where there are lots of products I enjoy that are very cheap. My rent is cheap and I'm happy. And my wealth, if you look at it, is a person in the middle class has infinite times more wealth than I do because I have loans. So my wealth is negative. So when Bernie Sanders says things about how a top 0.1% has more than a ton of America, well, it ignores the fact that there's a huge margin of people at the very bottom who have negative wealth. So anybody in the middle already has more than all those people combined, and then some. So I just feel like his framing of comparing the top to the bottom and using the frame as wealth is completely misleading. There are people who live great lifestyles and have manageable debt, and they have close to negative wealth, and it's fine. But it just kind of flows into his preconceived orientation and how he looks at things. I understand some people are struggling, and a lot of middle class people do struggle, but I just don't feel like the answer is necessarily government, and that's kind of the cudgel he beats you with. He beats you with these people are prospering while these people are not. So clearly, we need to take some from them and give it to others. It just doesn't seem like a be-all answer for me. And you can have a quick rebuttal to that, and we'll talk about it a little bit more later.
Sure. I think that whatever tax bracket you're in, whatever however much your income is, we as a society should want everybody to have the basic necessities. We should, and I'm not saying you don't want that or the Republicans don't want that. I think majority of Americans want that, which is why, as I say, I don't feel bad when I think, oh, if you have more money, you should pay more taxes, because it's going back into society. It's not just going to the government. It should not just be going to the government and the government, hiding it somewhere. The government, not so. Let me put it in a phrase. Not only do we need to change tax policy, we need to change how those taxes are used.
Okay. I'm going to not respond to that because we do not have time on this topic. There's a lot there. It'll come up in the future. I have some willpower, though. So we're moving on to Kamala Harris's town hall. The thing that caught my eye was it was kind of a throwaway line. It got a lot of media coverage. She essentially briefly talked about guns, and she said if she becomes president, if Congress will not act, she will, which implied she was willing to use executive power to enforce gun regulations, which one of the few good things about Trump and everybody in the Democrats hating his guts is I thought that would make them weary of executive overreach. But apparently it only took one CNN town hall before Kamala Harris opens up about how she's okay with using the executive branch to create legislation that Congress should enact. So I hear people say this kind of sentiment a lot, though, on a lot of issues. To give Kamala Harris some credit, this is not a unique thing to her. She's not the only person I think that's making this error. A lot of people say Congress is broken, so the president should act. Like it's just an obvious thing. But we have powers clearly outlined in our Constitution, and I don't think one person should be able to act in a way that overrides Congress. I'm one of those people who think I believe that inaction or not having an opinion is a stance. It's a valid stance. That's why I'm not a big fan of making everybody vote. For example, I think not voting is your freedom of speech. You can choose to not vote, and that's how I feel. I feel like Congress not making an action is still Congress doing its job. It doesn't have enough people to agree on a piece of legislation. So it not passing a piece of legislation is Congress essentially making a stance on that issue by doing nothing. So when we have gridlock and then nobody compromises, then we agree the status quo is better than whatever we come up with for compromising. The executive's job isn't to say, well, you guys couldn't fix it. Like you're essentially forcing this normative definition of what fixing it is to fit the president's preconceived notion on what it is to fix the problem, right? So this is just executive overreach to the highest degree. I don't like it whether it's a Republican or a Democrat. I'm not happy that Kamala Harris owns up to it without even, having more than 10% in the polls. She's already like, yeah, I'll do that. Executive overreach, here I come. So I was not a fan.
I don't have that much to disagree with you on this point, actually. I think, well, first of all, if you really look at if you study the U.S. history, the Senate was almost designed to not get things done.
Yeah.
It was pretty much designed to be a brick wall because if you look at, I don't have any particular bills on off the top of my head, but if you look at some of the bills how the House has passed, they are atrocious. They are absolutely atrocious, and the Senate has often either refused to vote on the bills or voted against them. So, and when it comes to the executive orders and how much power the president should have, again, I don't have much to disagree with you. I think once again, we have to ask ourselves, how much power do we want the president to have? Of course, the Constitution was also written to be somewhat ambiguous, to be debatable. So that's my stance.
Okay, yeah, and just some closing thoughts on this before we move on. It's just that there's this commonplace notion now that, especially with the amount of technology we have that enables transparency so people know what's going on every day, that gridlock in Congress is a bug, not a feature. It's definitely a feature. I thought it was great because I used to be a conservative and not like a libertarian. And I used to love the fact that there was gridlock during the Obama era because all of Obama's ideas, I thought they were trash. I mean, I still do mostly think they're trash. So the fact that Congress didn't do anything, I was like, this is awesome. They're not going to give him his stupid ideas to sign in. Now that Trump's president, it's weird that Democrats are like, Congress is not acting. Even if Congress was all Democrats, they would piece together legislation and then Trump would veto it. Congress acting would not matter. If Congress was acting now, it would be in Republicans' favor. So the fact that, and then it's also, the whole point of gridlock is so every time a new president is elected and a new Congress comes in, not everything is immediately undone. We have consistency because of this gridlock, which is a nice feature. But yeah, so we're going to wrap up on that note, and then you're going to, damn, the alarm made sound. That scared the shit out of me. And you're going to talk about the thing from Kamala Harris town hall that struck you the most.
Yes. What struck me the most, now this is a very thorny issue, so, and I'm sure we will, as we've said with most things, we will touch on it again in the future. She was asked about reparations. Does she think that reparations are a good thing that should be? Does she think reparations should be implemented? And she basically dodged the question. That kind of annoyed me a little. I mean, she said, we can have a conversation about it. I want to study. I think she said, I'm trying to pass a bill that would implement a study as to whether
it was like a bill to make a committee that would study it.
Yes. Which it seemed to me, the typical politician thing to say. Don't give her answer. Just say, well, we should have a committee. I don't know. Well, I'll just say, I think, again, I'm not an expert on this either, but I think reparations are probably a necessity. I think our country is one of the wealthiest in the world, and a lot of that wealth was built on slave labor. And I think, again, we will never be able to fully compensate or repay for past damages, but I think reparations of some sort would be the closest we could get to remedying the current situation involving race.
Okay, so I'm gonna say two things. One, I'm gonna say I'm not for reparations because of all the commonplace conservative arguments you hear. I'm very sympathetic towards them. It's hard to, well, it's hard to punish certain people and reallocate wealth based on things that happened when none of us were alive. I think I understand why people would say that's an issue. I think there's a better argument for a lot of local policy that's happened all across the country that has held back minority populations in different ways. But, doing it in a federal way, there's so many difficulties there. So one thing I will say, if you are a fan of reparations, I would point you in the direction of Cory Booker, because in his town hall, he talked about something. I'm a masochist, so I did this thing where I listened to every 2019 CNN town hall for the Democrats in the last week, and it was a horrible thing. I was not enjoying it, but I did it for you guys. And with Cory Booker, he talks about this idea of he wants to remedy the income. Well, it's not the income gap; it's the wealth gap between minority communities and like white communities by doing this thing where you put money into an account for every kid, and then it will essentially, it's a bond. And then every year, depending on the kid's parents' income, you put more money in it. And then when they turn 18, they can use it for things like college and all this stuff. And it addresses the racial issues through the wealth, by looking at the wealth. And then you avoid all the problems. He doesn't say it this way, but this is how I see it. You avoid all the problems of deciding which black people get reparations. You only give it to people who are descended from slaves. Do you give it from people descended in a certain way? I'm pretty sure I heard it was somebody who was half black, half white. They were talking about this issue, and they were I think it was actually, no, Cory Booker did say this. He's descended from a slave owner and a slave, and a lot of things like that. So how the hell would that work? The easiest way, if you think the real issue is actually racial wealth, is just addressing wealth as a whole and trying to equalize that for kids who are poor to like kind of to level the opportunity when they turn 18. I'm not a fan of reparations, but if you're going to be a fan and you actually think the racial wealth gap is the issue, Cory Booker's plan is the most comprehensive thing that makes sense that I've seen. And Kamala Harris taking that half-ass stance about like we should study it was terrible. It was hard to watch. So yeah, I was just throwing that out there.
I haven't watched Cory Booker's town hall, but I certainly will when I get the chance.
Yeah, no, I would recommend that for anybody who that thinks that's an interesting issue. If you're going to go about it in the most practical way, that just seems like the way to go, like hands down. Do you have a closing thought, or do we want to move on to Mayor Pete?
We can move on.
Okay. So I'm just going to real quick talk about a random part from Mayor Pete's town hall, because not a lot jumped out to me after watching so many Democrat town halls. So he made a really bad argument for breaking up big tech, mostly because he framed it in such a poor way. Pretty much, he brings up big tech. He says, all you guys didn't realize they were a monopoly because you get their service for free, but they actually are a monopoly, so we break them up. So the reason why monopolies are an issue is because one company gets to dictate the price of a product, and then they can maximize the price way higher than what is reasonable, but still profit the most. Google clearly doesn't do that to people like me and my co-host because we don't pay anything for Google. We just search. So if he wants to actually make this argument, I'm sitting there, I'm a 22-year-old guy, and it's like you completely missed the way to call Google a monopoly. Google's a monopoly on advertising. They're the majority of online advertising. So he should say, all of you guys love Google, but you don't know they're actually a monopoly. You're the product. And you know what they're doing is they're charging crazy prices on advertising because they have all the market share. So even if you're getting this great product, they're using you and they're profiting off you. That's how he should have phrased it. I'm not even for breaking up Google, but that's how he should have played it. And he just played it in such a lazy way. Like he hasn't actually thought about it. He just knows it's a Democratic Party platform line. So he just kind of said it. I just thought it was lazy, kind of drove me nuts because it's this young guy who I was listening to him and I felt like he could be the Obama of this race. And then he just said something that was like a throwaway that he hadn't even thought about. So that's my rant. I don't expect you to have any thoughts on that. No, yes, go ahead if you do.
No, really. I don't. Yeah, I don't have. I don't want to say anything where I don't feel I have enough know-how.
Gotcha.
Then I'd just be talking out of my ass.
No, that's totally fair. That was like a weird thing that struck me, and I had to say something, and I don't expect most people to have even noticed that line. Okay, so go ahead, talk about the point that got your attention, and we'll talk about it for more than a bit. It's the last part we're going to cover for this episode.
Sure. The part that struck me was when he argued against corporate personhood and against the idea that money is free speech. We already talked about the money part slightly with Bernie Sanders, but we didn't talk about corporate personhood with, I think the law was Citizens United, if I remember correctly. I think that was the law that said, or the Supreme Court ruling that said corporations are people. We probably disagree on this. I'm not certain.
Yeah, we do.
Okay. Because I'm dead against the idea that corporations are people, because then, in my view, you just get, or it's very easy to live in a country where corporations dictate policy. And I think, there's nothing wrong with corporations in and of themselves. But when you give a corporation personhood, I think you give a corporation way too much power.
Okay, so I guess this is where the argument loses me. I end up coming off as a Kantian in the way I think, because I'm very much a means to a person. If you're arguing from the ends of the result, but the means strikes me as wrong, then I kind of don't really care because your means is wrong. So the issue that comes to me is a corporation is really just a band of individuals who are working together to a product, and it all benefits them. So like when I worked at a financial firm briefly, I was paid a certain amount of money to show up there. I was an individual. I worked for the firm. And the firm is really just everybody who showed up to work every day operating under a name. So once you put a restriction on a firm, you're restricting the individuals within the firm. So I see the corporation not as just this nameless entity. I just see it as a group of people. And the group of people still has a bunch of individual rights. So when you say a corporation can't do something because they're not a person, I feel like you missed the whole point of it's just a group of people. You might as well say like 10 people who got together can't do something because it's 10 people and not one. I don't, it just seems like you're allowing yourself to restrict individual rights by saying you're restricting group rights. And honestly, the practical case for it, I see your concern. I do have some disagreements with it. I don't necessarily buy the conclusions that a lot of people on the left are making. Because every time we see corporations involve themselves in things, they get blowback. And I think that with more transparency in our world, corporations are less likely to do anything crazy with their money politically because they'll get blowback from it. So yeah, I'm not as sold, and I think there's a good case that corporations are just a group of people, so they should have rights. If you want to talk about money in politics, though, like specifically money in politics, not on the corporate side, but on the individual side and rich people, I am definitely in disagreement with you on money being speech. Well, I guess I don't know if I necessarily like the phrase money as speech. But if you have money, I feel like it's your money to spend. So like if I go up to a broadcast station and I say, I really like Bernie Sanders. I love him so much that I want to give you guys $30,000 to air this 15-second bit on your network. And then they go, oh, we love $30,000. That's a lot of money. I should be able to hand them my money and they should be able to put my bit on TV. And I don't see why the government should go, hey, you can't tell everybody you love this person by spending your money. It's this weird ideal that everybody should be able to put the same amount of their voice out there into the ether. But some people are going to automatically have more influence than other people. If somebody has 2 million Twitter followers and I have 10, that guy has more influence than me. I don't think the government should do anything about that. Why does it matter if someone can pay money to get an ad on TV? It's their money. So it loses me. The argument, I don't know, it doesn't do much for me.
I think money makes the world go around, as anybody knows, if you want to have a certain level of comfort, you have to have money. If you know, for us to be able to have this conversation, we either we or our families or both had to have the money to get the proper equipment to have this conversation. I don't think that people should be banned from giving money to politicians. I think we need to limit the amount of money that is given to politicians. That is the distinction that I would make, because yes, some people have more money. Doesn't make them evil, but it does cause an unfair advantage.
So one thing that I would implore people to look into is there's actually some research out there about money being put into elections and it not being correlated with the people who win. The best argument, I think, for money not being in politics is when people make the gatekeeper argument and pretty much think that a candidate can only even get nominated for their party if they have a certain amount of money, and they're going to end up being like establishment pawns for their party. I thought that was pretty convincing until Bernie Sanders and Andrew Yang showed up, and both of them aren't supported by a ton of money. You see more and more Democrats renouncing taking money from corporate PACs, and they're getting spotlight without taking that money. From what I see it, the amount of ad money spent isn't going to flip people from Donald Trump to Bernie Sanders or Bernie Sanders to Donald Trump. I just think it's an overstated thing. I don't think there's a lot of evidence that it really makes a huge difference. And without a ton of evidence, you're going to limit people's rights. Even if you're saying we put a limit on $20,000 from a person, you've now legally prohibited a consensual transaction of that $20,000 and first dollar. And I just don't see why, if you can't even, there's not conclusive evidence irrefutably that it makes this huge, horrible impact. Like, I get that it's unfortunate, it makes things inefficient, but you're stripping people's rights. It just doesn't do it for me, man.
I don't quite follow the argument that we would be limiting people's rights. Well, because that's what it means to be in a society. We're constantly juggling what rights should an individual have and what rights does an individual not have. So I don't think I don't buy that argument.
I think you certainly have the right to do what you want with your own money. Your money is your property. Money is property, right? If you have $10,000, that's your $10,000. You can do what you want with it as long as you're not hurting another individual. Me buying television space ads or ads online isn't like physically harming anybody. I'm just saying, look at this shitty ad, and everybody hates ads anyways. It's like, if I want to buy that, I can buy it. It's just like how I went to get lunch and I bought a sandwich. That's why I chose to do with my money. It's not harming anybody. It's not a crime. But you're making it illegal.
Well, I disagree. There's a difference between, buying a sandwich or buying this microphone that I got, or spending putting a lot of money into a particular candidate, because who is in power? It's important who is in power. And I think I'd have to look at that study you're talking about, but I do think that money in politics, it's not the only concern, but it is a concern nonetheless.
Yeah, it's just one of those things for me, I guess. It's just, if somebody has money and they want to do something with it, I'm not going to stop them until it hurts somebody, right? As long as there's a consensual. And I would argue
it could potentially hurt somebody if you funnel money into the wrong candidate, or into a candidate that is going to perpetuate bad policies.
Okay, so I think the reason why that loses me is because the problem isn't that you funneled money to them. The problem is that then they harmed someone, right? It's like how I think it's fine to do cocaine, but it's not fine to punch someone in the face when you're on cocaine. The problem is you punch someone in the face, not the fact they did cocaine. But I think I think it comes down to if you want to define harm more loosely or broadly. If you define harm as, well, then this person changes taxes and now it economically harms somebody. It's a whole thing. But luckily, we spent like 10 minutes on this because we saved time on the less important topics. And that was a fun little back and forth, and we'll touch on it more in the future. So yeah, do you have any closing thoughts on all 5 of them as a whole or anything? Do you just want to, any broad statements you took away? Because I know you watched them all in like a day.
I think 2020, or I will be very curious as to who gets the nomination. I think there are some. I think the candidates, most of the candidates, I could see myself voting for. Perhaps not all of them. And I obviously, the more time, the more the longer the campaign goes on, the more specific I'll be able to get. But I think that I think the Democrats are. I think some good candidates are coming up. The question is, will the Democrats have learned from their mistake in 2016, or will they continue on putting a square peg in a round hole? And if they continue putting a square peg in a round hole, then I think we're in for some real. We're in for it. We're in deep.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot more town halls that'll come up that we'll get to touch on, and there's going to be debates at some point eventually. And Joe Biden officially announced he's in the race, so we're going to see how that shakes out. So this will be fun. I'm glad we covered this as much as I mean, if you can't tell from how I took how I feel about every point we've talked about today, I was wincing a lot while I listened to all the town halls. But I'm looking forward to diving more into the issues. I'm going to try to listen to Andrew Yang's book on audiobook soon. So maybe we'll have a substantive conversation about more policies in the near future. So
I have seen his town hall as well.
Yeah, his was he's an interesting guy. He has ideas. He comes off smart. But yeah, so to wrap things up, if you want more content, we're going to be posting on here weekly. We record these Tuesday nights, so we'll expect them either late Tuesday or Wednesday. You can follow me on Twitter at Matt Keck blog. My last name's Keck, spelled K-E-C-K, not K-E-K. So don't confuse those. Yeah, I don't know if you want to tell anybody where they can find you, or if you just want to reiterate what we do.
If anyone wants to find me elsewhere, they can find me on YouTube. Just type in The Anti-Philosopher. That's my YouTube channel name. I try to post videos on there when I can, but news, politics, hobbies, and anything that really catches my fancy. Yeah, just if you like this podcast, share it. Come back every week. There are all sorts of podcasts you can listen to. We obviously can never hope to be the be all end all,
Yeah.
but we hope we can spread the necessary information and entertain a few people along the way.
Yeah, and get some of our thoughts out too. And I did want to add that if you do check out my Twitter, I do every now and then. You hear the prolonged rants I go on this show sometimes. I might be doing a little bit of an offshoot with some videos of me going on similar rants, and then sometimes I post stuff on like Medium when I just feel the need to throw all my thoughts into like a 800-word essay. So yeah, feel free to check us out there. But overall, yeah, that was good. That was fun, and I look forward to doing this again next week. So signing off, it's Matt and Matthew.